And so we're going to go ahead and start this session. We're lucky. We have two folks from Department of Natural Resources, both Sam and Laura are here. They are with the Coastal Restoration Specialists working in the Shoreline Conservation Service. They provide property owners with technical and financial assistance to implement living shorelines. The Shoreline Conservation Service team manages the Shoreline Erosion Loan Program, which provides communities and nonprofits, local governments, and private property with access to interest-free loans so that they then can install living shorelines. And so we're excited to hear from them this evening. Thank you both for being here. And without further ado, we'll turn it over to Sam and Laura.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for having us. And thanks for joining us this evening. It's a cold evening, so hopefully you all are safe and sound at home. Cozy mug of tea or another beverage of your choosing. We'll do our best to provide some entertainment, and maybe we'll all learn something along the way. At the very least, I hope we all take away an even deeper appreciation of this incredible natural resource that we all are incredibly fortunate to live near and enjoy throughout the year. Also, a big thank you to the other presenters for sharing their ongoing research and specialized design expertise. These are some of the best minds working to preserve and restore Maryland's expansive shorelines. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. So this is the general path that we'll walk through during our presentation. The overall goal of our presentation is to talk generally about shorelines, the past, present, and future approaches to shoreline management in Maryland, and to set the stage for the following presentations, which will be a bit more advanced. So next slide, please. Sam and I work for the Shoreline Conservation Service within Maryland's Department of Natural Resources. This program was established in 1968 through legislation and aims to provide both technical and financial assistance to Maryland's waterfront property owners. This service is for any waterfront property owner, which includes state, county, municipalities, nonprofits, and private landowners. And the technical assistance could include site visits, site assessments, regulatory guidance, and public engagement such as this presentation. Financial assistance is provided through our zero interest loan, as we mentioned, for living shorelines. It can fund both design and construction of living shoreline projects and is available for all of Maryland's waterfront property owners. And more on this later.
All right, so a quick overview of Maryland shorelines. Maryland has a huge amount of tidal shoreline. Depending on how you measure it, it could be between 3,000 and 7,000 linear miles. No matter which figure you use, it's still an amazing statistic. To put that number in perspective, compare it to the state of California, which has about 3,147 linear miles. That's including all of the oceanfront, bays, tributaries, and islands. So we got a lot of shoreline. Here in Maryland, those shorelines are 85 to 95% privately owned, and erosion is affecting all 16 counties as well as Baltimore City. This erosion is exacerbated by sea level rise, land subsidence, which is a result of the glaciers receding from the last ice age, and human activities like boat wakes, large boat wakes, as well as hardening of our shorelines. The most recent numbers that we could find are 18% of Maryland shorelines are hardened, and some rivers and tributaries are as high as 80% hardened. And we'll talk about why that statistic is significant a little bit later on. So erosion, good or bad? Is it a good or bad thing? You can respond in the comments, give me your opinion. My answer is it's complicated. Erosion is not always a bad thing, but erosion is a natural process. It helps to maintain beaches, marshes, and offshore habitats, including underwater grasses, which if you like crabs in the Chesapeake Bay, you like underwater grasses. The ecological health of the estuary actually depends on it. The following presenter may touch on this, but the Chesapeake is actually starved for high quality sediment. There is a difference between suspended sediments in pollution-laden stormwater runoff when compared to sediment caused by erosion. Erosion becomes a problem when it threatens valuable natural resources, infrastructure, and property that we owned. as Marylanders, we have the right to protect that shoreline from eroding. I thought those were pretty photos as well. Well, the one on the left's pretty. The one on the right's a little scary. So if you've spent any amount of time on or around the bay, you're familiar with traditional approaches to combat erosive forces. These can look like rock revetments, bulkheads made of timber, metal, vinyl. From day one, these structures do a really good job of stopping erosion. Different materials and practices offer different levels of protection and durability. Rock size, height of structure, the use of filter fabric behind them all contribute to efficacy and long-term durability. The revetment on the left is actually a beautiful revetment. The contractor did a really great job, and it will provide shoreline protection for a long time to come. The bulkhead on the right is showing some age and is likely toward the end of its functional life. Both these structures, however, drastically change the ecosystem by severing or interrupting the connection of water to the land. It can have an effect on small fish, turtles, wading birds, just to name a few. You can picture that installing structural approaches like this to 80% of a body of water could have a drastic impact on the function of that ecosystem. So yeah, we have some photos here, just some photos of structural shorelines that have reached kind of the end of their functional life. Wood bulkheads, the timber will rot, metal tiebacks will corrode, silt fence can fail between the layers, the protective layers, or sometimes storm waves larger than the structure was designed to withstand could cause them to fail. So is there a better way to protect shoreline in Maryland? We've been talking a lot about structural approaches. We're going to compare them now to nature-based solutions. A nature-based solution looks at the whole ecosystem from the shallow water habitat all the way up to the land, not just the single problem of erosion. The goal is to use natural systems to create a more resilient shoreline that also provides ecosystem benefits. If this is done correctly, the shoreline should be weakest on the first day and become stronger over time.
So because, as Sam mentioned, green infrastructure becomes stronger over time, it can hold up well against different coastal storms. And we see this a lot with hurricanes in North Carolina, which is where I'm from, and why I want to share some of this information. Um, During Hurricane Irene in 2011, 76% of bulkheads in the Outer Banks were damaged during the storm, compared to none of the coastal habitats that were studied. Um, and similarly, during Hurricane Florence in 2018, there was major flooding throughout the state and damage throughout the state. And areas that had green solutions like oyster reefs and living shorelines did much better than areas without. NOAA had reported that the Beaufort living shoreline was still intact after the storm with minimal damage compared to other structures nearby. And although these studies are from a different state, it can be really helpful to see examples of how green infrastructure, like living shorelines, can hold up during these major storm events compared to green infrastructure.
So what is a living shoreline? Our definition of a living shoreline is a suite of techniques used to reduce erosion and enhance habitat by restoring and or enhancing natural features while maintaining coastal processes. Here are a couple typical features integrated into living shorelines in some sort of combination. We have marshes, beach strand, headlands, groins, sills, offshore breakwaters, tombolos, cobble, shingle beaches, woody vegetation and debris, all kind of represent elements of a living shoreline that could be used in some sort of combination. The shoreline that you're seeing on the right is the before and after photo. This was a shoreline that was constructed. If you've ever been to Assateague Island on Maryland's eastern shore, right before the Verrazano Bridge, it's on the left, and it was constructed to protect freshwater wetlands, a parking lot, and some picnic areas. This project consists of vegetated headlands made of cobble and wetland plants, sand beaches, vegetated dunes to reduce pollution and increase public access. And then here we have some more examples, photos of those techniques used on different restoration projects, living shoreline projects. So we've got headland breakwaters, vegetated headlands, that's Assateague Shoreline, just another shot, sills, groins, shingle beaches, core fiber logs, and then you see those two structural shorelines on the right. So those are, again, stopping the shoreline erosion at that moment, but they're not providing all those other benefits and not the potential resilience of living shorelines.
So now that we know what are living shorelines, we can talk about kind of why choose living shorelines. And this is a list of some of the benefits that living shorelines can offer. There, as you can see, a ton of potential benefits. Erosion control is a huge one, as the vegetation in a living shoreline will hold the soil in place with its roots and absorb and dissipate wave energy, wind, and storm surges. As I mentioned before, storm protection. There's a statistic that 15 feet of marsh can absorb 50% of incoming wave energy, as well as shoreline stabilization, where the shoreline can gain stability and build up over time by trapping sediment and adapting to changes, and is more resilient and able to bounce back after a storm. There's also water quality improvements, where vegetation naturally filters pollutants, excess nutrients, and sediment from runoff. There's also habitat creation and connectivity by the shoreline providing food, shelter, and nursery for many of the species that we hold dear, like fish, shellfish, birds, and turtles, and kind of restore the land-water interface that is often lost with coastal development. There's sometimes carbon sequestration benefits because coastal wetlands store carbon. There are often enhanced fisheries by providing fisheries habitat, and recreational and aesthetic value through fishing and wildlife viewing like waterfowl. And so these benefits may not be a result of every project, but it depends on the goal of the project, the design, the site conditions, but these are some of the potential benefits you could see from a living shoreline. So now the fun part, the policy. To encourage greener, softer techniques, in 2008, Maryland passed the Living Shoreline Act, which was the very first statewide effort to promote living shorelines over hardened erosion control methods. Um, and so this basically set the standard that shore erosion control projects must consist of non-structural shoreline stabilization measures that preserve the natural environment, unless a waiver is obtained from the Maryland Department of the Environment, or MDE, or the project shoreline has been mapped by MDE as an area that is appropriate for a structural measure like a bulkhead or abutment. So when a living shoreline is not suitable and there's a waiver, the living shoreline approaches should still be incorporated where possible. So this is kind of all about like still trying to design a project that fits the landscape that's there and uses techniques that are relevant to the site through scientific analysis and coastal engineering principles. So first, to talk about the living shoreline waiver. This form does not necessarily grant a waiver, but it helps to determine if the conditions are suitable for a non-structural measure of shoreline erosion control. So in making the feasibility determination, there are a number of factors that are considered by MDE, which are listed here. There's primarily, I guess, excessive erosion, the area being subject to heavy tides, or if the area is too narrow for the effective use of a non-structural measure. So all the decisions are kind of based on this form and the data provided, as well as sometimes a site visit and site-specific conditions. And then MDE will make a determination based on this information. And then sometimes we at DNR will kind of weigh in on this process as part of the technical assistance that we provide. And so the second thing is the Maryland Shoreline Stabilization Mapper, which delineates areas where living shorelines are a suitable treatment option for shoreline erosion control, or where waivers should be permissible given the specific site conditions. And so this was made by MDE in partnership with BIMS. And as you can see from the legend, it maps the shoreline in 3 different ways. The first in blue there is a living shoreline, where a shoreline project is the preferred approach given the site conditions. The second is kind of in that like yellowy color, and that's undetermined, where the property owner should coordinate a site visit with MDE project manager and complete the waiver request form if they'd like a waiver. And then the third in red is structural shoreline stabilization measure, which is predetermined decision by MDE that a person is not required to construct a living shoreline given the site conditions and can construct a more gray solution. So to kind of summarize this policy piece, the Living Shoreline Act in 2008 made living shorelines the preferred measure of shoreline protection and erosion control. But in situations where a living shoreline may not be feasible given the site conditions, the shoreline mapper and the waiver request form can kind of help make that determination. So that's kind of the end of our presentation. Thank you all so much for your time today. Sam and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have during the panel session, as well as we provide our emails here, so you're welcome to reach out to us with any questions.
Cool. So yeah, I get the privilege to introduce our next speaker, Cindy Palinkas, Associate Professor at University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Horn Lab, in collaboration with Lori Staver and many other Horn Point facility staff and students. She has a BA in Earth and Planetary Science, Johns Hopkins, MS and PhD of Geological Oceanography, University of Washington, impressive, and has been at UMCES since '05 and has contributed hugely to the understanding of living shorelines and continues to. So take it away, Cindy.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, that just sort of hits the highlights of stuff. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I'll be talking about what my lab does at Horn Point Lab in Cambridge, and I work with lots of other folks. My specialty is in sediment. So basically, I study mud. And so I wanted this slide to give everyone just an overarching, like, what kind of research does my lab do? And then how does the living shoreline research fit in that? So I study mud in and around Chesapeake Bay. Looks like playing in marshes and shallow water. And the big questions is, how do mud and sand from land get into the adjacent water? Where does it go? How do people influence that supply via land and shoreline uses and/or management? And how does it interact with plants like SAV or submerged aquatic vegetation and marshes? And the overall motivation is so that we have resilient coasts. And what that means is that when we have a big storm or something like that, the coastline is able to withstand that storm and perhaps even build back better. And that all leads us to healthy bay ecosystems. So the photos along the bottom, we sort of go from the one on the left that we have an eroding shoreline, maybe some murky water. We move towards something in the middle that has a living shoreline. So we have a healthy marsh growing there. The water might be clearer. And all of that leads to water that we can interact with ourselves, whether that's swimming, and I have photos of a child, my nephew, and grown-ups playing in the water. But we also like to fish in the water, and we like to boat on the water, and we like to do all kinds of great stuff in the water. And so we want to have healthy water to do that. I will echo what Sam said, that not all sediment is bad. I think of it like food. Like, we know that for people, too much food is bad. And so we hear a lot about too much sediment being bad for the bay. But we also know that too little food is also bad. Like, we need a certain amount to be healthy. And the same is true of the bay. We need sediment to nourish our marshes and stuff like that. So what we're really thinking about is like extra sediment and how we can kind of keep our bay in a healthy way. This is where I convince everyone that it's really fun. So these are just photos of me and my students just playing out in the field and the lab over the years. We use a variety of techniques, usually involves going through a marsh of some sort. And because I study sediment, most of what I do uses something like that middle picture where you see a tube with a crossbar, and we just push it into the sediment, just like if you were going to the beach or something like that, and you push the tube in and then bring it up. And then you can read the layers of that and read what has happened over time at that spot. It's the same general concept of, like, you took a core, like an apple core or something like that, and you put it through your lasagna. You could read what layer you put down first would be at the bottom, etc. So that's just how we do things. So for living shorelines, our specific questions is, the first thing we want to do is see if they work, right? And by work, we're defining that as reducing shoreline erosion. That's like the main thing. If they don't do that, then, like, I mean, it's pretty, but it's not really helpful. Another big question is what happens to adjacent SAV beds after installation. So SAV is those submerged aquatic vegetation, or seagrasses. This is a really big management and permitting concern. And so having some science behind that framework is really important. Then we want to know how sediment and plant characteristics change as our living shorelines age. So how do I know, for example, I put in a living shoreline today, as Sam and Laura said, they get stronger as we go through time, but how do I know if my living shoreline is like following the path towards being awesome in a few years? And then we want to think about whether the design matters. So on the bottom, the left of the green line are folks that have funded parts of this work over the years. It's a nice group of state, federal, and private folks. And then to the right of that are people that have generously given us their time and expertise and helped us understand the challenges in permitting, which is done through the Maryland Department of the Environment, and also the perspective of folks who construct these things, Unity Landscape and Shore Rivers. So we've cobbled together lots of study sites across multiple projects. So the map that you're looking at, we, I think, are pretty familiar with the Chesapeake Bay. So I don't need to be like, this is Maryland, this is the Bay. So the one on the left is showing you the eastern shore of the Bay, Talbot counties, Queen Anne County, and then the star is at Horn Point Lab in Cambridge in Dorchester County. So you can see that the sites that we have in the Chesapeake are all kind of in the middle range with middle salinity. And then on the right-hand side, we do have a few sites that are in the Maryland coastal bays, including the project at Assateague that Sam was talking about. We've been there to monitor to see how well it's doing as well. And the photos on the bottom are just photos from the field. So we, not me, Lori and her staff, literally count the plants. So we figure out how many plants are in a square, what kind of plants they are, how tall they are, all that good stuff. We go out and we use the thing. If you squint, you might be able to see the thing that looks like a staff on the right-hand most photo. That is actually a high precision GPS unit that records elevation. So we know how far we are above mean sea level. And of course, we take sediment cores as well. So the first thing we know is that living shoreline installation generally, not always, but usually, takes the shoreline and moves it seaward into adjacent shallow water habitat. So what you're looking at here is a drone image from one of our sites at West Ocean City. And this is the before photo. So there's kind of that light gray coloring is where the shoreline was before the living shoreline went in. And if you can do the next thing, it'll bring up the after. So that's the after photo. If you squint, there is a dotted red line that shows you where that the existing shoreline was. And then all of that bright colored stuff that moved outward into the shallow water is the living shoreline. And this is right after it was installed, again, a drone image. And so I think you can see really clearly that most times these are constructed by putting in clean sand fill, which is that bright brown color, and then you'd have to squint pretty hard, but you can see little pinpricks that are the actual little plugs of plants that they plant. So here's your first really sciencey word, Backy. You can impress your friends. That what we use is called a Backy inspired monitoring design. Backy means before, after, control, impact. It's a very standard way of looking at changes before and after a project of any sort, any experiment you want to do. So you want to measure before, like what's there before it goes in, right after, so you know what changed exactly. And then you want to have a control or a place where you didn't touch anything. So on the left-hand side of the photo, you can see the reference marsh. That is, we take samples there. That's not directly impacted by the installation. So this is sort of, what if I didn't put in my living shoreline? What would happen? And then we have the impact or the living shoreline side. So that's just the framework of what we use. There won't be a quiz, but you can impress your friends if you want. And the reason for that is that we know that weather and other drivers vary over time. So this is a plot that tells us what we know intuitively, I think. I'm just showing you the rainfall total before our sampling. We go out in the spring and in the fall. And when we look at the rainfall, sure enough, we get more rain in the spring, less in the fall. And you can imagine if you were a plant, like the plants in your garden, they vary a lot in response to rainfall, temperature, all of the things. So we want to make sure we're capturing that. The next thing, please. We also have sea level rise. So this is data from the NOAA buoy at Cambridge, Maryland. It's been faithfully recording the sea level since the mid to late 1970s. So each dot on this graph is the monthly average sea level. And then along the bottom, with time marching towards more recent times to the right. And what you can see, there's lots of ups and downs, which we know, again, intuitively, we have tides, we have bigger tides in the fall. Usually, if you think about being in Cambridge, we typically get our big floods in the fall, that sort of thing. So there's going to be some up and downs, but there's a really clear increase over time. And the rate is about 2.2 inches per year. And my favorite trivia factoid is that fingernails grow at about 3.5 millimeters per year. And this is 4 millimeters per year. So it's about the same as your fingernails grow, which is like not a big deal from day to day, but like definitely I notice it after some time. So in any case, there's lots of things that vary over time. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding what changed because of the living shoreline and what changed just because we had a wet year that year. Okay, so the first question, do living shorelines work? And I'm not going to go through like all of the gory details, but I'm happy to talk about them afterwards or any other time with anyone. But I just want to show you quickly how we figured this out and what we did. There's lots of aerial images available. There's the Maryland Coastal Atlas, which is a really great tool if you're curious about your spot in Maryland and you want to know almost anything about it. You can go to the Maryland Coastal Atlas and find out great stuff. But what's there is they have shorelines from 1942 and 1994. We can get other shorelines from Google Earth, which is what you're seeing on the right. We also have aerial photos from satellites, so all those good things. So we can trace where the shorelines are in a particular year and then simply measure the change over time. And so we did that, right? So the graph on the bottom, the numbers aren't super important. I just want you to see, so where the 0 is, where the vertical line is, lines up with the schematic above, where anything to the right of that line is land and anything to the left of it is water. So you're at the shoreline, the vertical line at 0. If you move backwards to the right, yes, to the right, you're seeing that shoreline move landward. So you're seeing that as erosion or loss of your shoreline, loss of property. And if you see it going to the left, it's going the other way. It's going out into the water or you're gaining property. So the two bars that I have for you is we have the before. So remember, we're doing a backy. So before any living shoreline went in at a whole bunch of sites around the bay, all kind of averaged together. The top is natural or reference, so where we didn't touch the shoreline with living shorelines, and the bottom is living shorelines. So before anything happened, there was erosion, as we would expect. That was a long-winded way of getting at. We had a lot of shoreline erosion at all of our shorelines. And then if you do the next thing, you'll see that now I have the after or install. So at the top, the reference shorelines are the ones where we didn't touch anything. They continue to erode. They continue to have that bar going to the right. Where we have a living shoreline, we moved that shoreline seaward. So we moved it out into the water. So that's right after install. And then the next thing, if you push it, yes, is that after install, I just had a master's student go through and measure all the shorelines. There's very little movement of that shoreline after installation. Like there's a little bit of wiggle around 0, but it's pretty much 0, which is amazing. So it really shows that we're stabilizing those shorelines the way that we would expect. Oh, you get a smiley face. Okay, next one. Okay, so then the second one is what happens to that seagrass or SAV after installation. And so another really great tool is the VIMS or the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. They have an SAV website where they take aerial images over most of the bay in most years, fairly continuously since 1984. And they also go out and like make sure that what they think is a seagrass from the plane is actually a seagrass. And what they do is they provide maps that look like the one that I'm showing here. And so you can go to that website, find your favorite shoreline, and just click through the years to see what the SAV or the seagrass has done over time. And so that's what we did, is we just used that database and asked what happened to SAV before and after living shorelines went in. But the first thing we have to understand is that SAV comes and goes in the region a lot. So these are data from the Choptank River, and just look at the pattern. All I really want you to see is that in the region, which is that green color or the quad, it goes up and down. And this trend is actually pretty typical for most of the Bay. Like, we have great highs, like in the late 90s. We have years where we kind of struggle a lot in the mid to late 2000s. And so if we want to understand or ask about the impact of living shoreline installation, we have to first understand that we have this variability over time. So this is now the brown dots is data at one of our living shoreline sites. So I just sat on my computer, I sat and clicked through the data and just recorded what the SAV was doing at that site. And so you can see it really overlaps. Maybe there's a bit of a time lag, but it's really just following the quad. So if I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know what year the living shoreline went in. If you do the next thing, I think it'll show it. There it goes. But there's really no difference, right? We're just following the region before and after installation. And then the next thing will be the reference site, and it plots almost exactly on top of the site. So the place where we don't have a living shoreline and the place where we do have a living shoreline, doing the same thing and also doing the same thing as what's going on in the region. So this impact of SAV is not, I want to be a little bit careful here, because what I also should have emphasized is that these are data offshore of the living shoreline. So we are not awesome. SAV offshore of the shorelines follow the trend in the larger area, but this is not looking at direct replacement. So we already talked about, we move that shoreline into shallow water habitat. And so doing so, we necessarily convert some of that shallow water habitat to a living shoreline or a marsh habitat. And so we're working on that piece right now. So that's not in here. This work with the SAV is offshore of that footprint. So stay tuned for that direct replacement and what that might look like. Okay, how do sediment and plant characteristics change? So this photo is from Hearst Creek, which is just upstream of Cambridge on the Choptank. And there was a living shoreline that went in like late 2002, early 2022, pardon me. So this is a photo right after the initial planting. So we see that clean sand, and you have to sort of struggle to see the little tiny plants. They're small and sparse. The question is, how do we go from something that looks like the photo on the left to something that looks like a natural marsh, which is what I'm showing on the right-hand side. This is the natural marsh, so the reference site for Hearst Creek. And so what we want is a living shoreline that looks like the photo on the right over time. Okay, so this is data from all of those dots on the map that I showed you. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, the up and down one, we're looking at the mud percent versus age, with our very new living shorelines are going to be all the way on the left, and our ones that are 15 years old are going to be all the way on the right. And as you go up, we have more mud. As you go down, we have less mud. And so at our new living shorelines, I just gave it a 0.5 because it wasn't like exactly 0, but it wasn't 1 either. Oh, I should have explained, the boxes are statistical. So not to get too wrapped up in the stats, but it shows you the spread. So if we have more than one living shoreline of a given age, we have a box that shows us essentially the spread of the observations. So we know that each living shoreline is going to be different, just like everybody's garden in their backyard is different. And what we want to understand is, like, how that changes over time, knowing that there's going to be some spread of the data. So the boxes are just showing you the general range of what we find for a given age. And where you see just a straight line, like for example, at 5 years, there's just a straight line. That means we only have one living shoreline of that age at that right now. We are actively working on filling in the blanks of this plot. So this is a little bit of a moving thing, but just to show you. So we start with very little mud. It's almost all sand. So we put in that clean sand. And then as we go over time, the plants grow and they start trapping mud or fine particles. The plants also start producing fine particles through through their roots, through leaves that decay. So think about like it's a very similar process to like all the leaves come off in the fall. And if you don't rake them, they will decompose and then you'll get kind of like this organic stuff on your lawn. So it's a very similar process in the marsh. And so what we see is that mud percent increases until we get to about exactly when we have our data gap, around 5 to 10-ish years, and then it kind of stabilizes. And so that tells us that our living shorelines kind of take about that long to stabilize and become much like a natural marsh. So the next thing is I have a bar where our reference marshes sit in their mud content. And so right around that 5 to 10 years is when we stabilize and look like a natural marsh. So we should expect in the first couple of years, we're going to be evolving along that trajectory. And then after that, we should be in a pretty stable place. And then lastly, does design matter? So there's lots of designs out there. I'm just showing you two in these photos. One is kind of an older technique at this point, I think, where you just have a continuous sill. So in the photo, along that shoreline where that middle dock is on the photo, you can see that there's kind of this like brownish, looks brown to me anyway, area just seaward towards the water from the lawn and the house. And then in front of that is a rock sill. And that's just a continuous thing. There are no gaps at all. And the one on the right is what we call a segmented sill, where you have gaps every so often along the way. This one happens to be at Oxford, where the playground is at the town, if you're familiar with that. Because this is a beautiful art that I love. My master's student, Erica Kuntz, worked with an intern from Maryland Sea Grant who produced this beautiful artistic rendering of a gap. And so it's literally a gap in the rocks. And the reason for that is to bring back kind of that connection between the land and the water that we need for to bring the tide in, to nourish our marsh, to also allow things like turtles and crabs and little fish, places that they can come in and use that marsh and then, you know, go back out if they need to or when it's time with the tide. And so that's great. But there was this open question of whether, you know, what do we give up? Do we give up a lot of erosion at that sill and kind of destroy our marsh kind of like little by little? Or do we give up a little bit of plants? Like maybe we don't have plants exactly in the sill, but we're getting a lot of really other great stuff. And, you know, on the whole, it's okay. And so that's why we were really interested in this question. And so this is a schematic put together by my master's student. And what she's showing is that in the gap, so let me see. So we have the rocks and then the two gaps kind of in the middle-ish there. And then we have not so many plants in the gaps, more plants behind the sill or the rock. And what we see is that we have erosion as the water is coming in. We have a little bit of a higher energy there just because it's getting squeezed in. So it's like your hose, when you make it the opening smaller, it gets faster. So we get a little bit of erosion, and then that sediment goes and gets transported behind the sills. And so it turns out that we do have little hot spots of erosion at those gaps, but we overall have the same functionality whether or not we have those gaps. So on the whole, we have the living shoreline is working just the same. So the answers so far, do living shorelines work and do they reduce erosion? Yes. We saw that if we don't do anything at those reference shorelines, we'll still continue to have that erosion. If we put in a living shoreline, we will generally build that shoreline out into the water, after which the shoreline itself stabilizes. What happens to SAV after installation? And I want to emphasize this is offshore of the project footprint. So we are not talking yet about that direct one-for-one conversion of shallow water to marsh that will be coming. But offshore of the footprint, SAV is really just following the regional trends before and after installation. How do sediment and plant characteristics change as living shorelines age? I didn't show you all of the data, but basically what we see is that sediment gets muddier, plants get denser. We go from something it's very sandy and little sparse plugs into something that looks like what we see in a natural marsh. And that happens, we think, around 8 to 10 years after installation. But we have a pretty big data gap there that we need to work on to get that exactly to better understand what that might be. And then, does design matter? Segmented soil designs, if we have a gap, we do get erosion hotspots there, but the overall performance in terms of where the shoreline is and how much marsh we have, it's similar to continuous sills. And so what we gain in putting back or restoring that connection between land and the water is probably offset that erosion hotspot that we get. So now it is Kenny's turn to be on the hot seat. So Kenny is one of my colleagues at Horn Point Lab at University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He got his BS in mathematics and biology at SUNY at Albany. He also went to the University of Washington, like all good scientists, got his master's and PhD there in fisheries, not oceanography, but that's cool. And then he went to Oak Ridge National Lab, became a professor/associate dean at Louisiana State University, and then came to UMC's at Horn Point Lab as the France Merrick Professor in Sustainable Ecosystem Restoration.
So what I want to talk about is some of the research I've been doing that is in the process or has great potential to be applied to living shorelines. And it's the co-benefits part we heard in the beginning, which is kind of a win-win situation. My focus will be on habitat. So there's flood protection, there's reducing erosion. We heard about living shorelines. There's hybrid structures, which mix living shorelines with gray infrastructure. All of that, I'm going to be talking about habitat and how do we go about assessing the habitat gains and losses, if there are, of different living shoreline designs. So this was a paper we recently completed, and you'll see there's quite a few Horn Point people on there, including Cindy. Next slide. Part of this was, we heard in the beginning, was about co-benefits. And we created, among other things, a table of all the different co-benefits that have been either identified or quantified or proposed from living shorelines. And we worked together to put together different people, call them different names. And was mentioned earlier, no single project does all of these. They usually work on a subset of these, but this is what you're saying is a partial list of a much bigger table. And you notice I circled habitat. We're going to be talking about that. And what else we did was summarize what people have measured or modeled to see whether that co-benefit is operating as designed and is fulfilling the expectations. And some of this you'll see the list from the earlier speakers. The list goes on, getting into tourism, recreational opportunities, aesthetics of nature, educational opportunities. Again, most projects have a small subset of these, but these are all that have been identified across many, many, many projects. So this is some of the work I've been doing at Horn Point that directly relates to living shorelines. So I'm a member of the STAC, which is the Science and Technical Advisory Committee for the Chesapeake Bay Program. And that top left, it's a report we spent a lot of time on called CSER, and it looked at how the Chesapeake Bay Program was doing and meeting its goals and what could be done to accelerate and improve that rate of success. What's in front of it is a supplement I wrote with a lot of other people about specifically assessing habitat effects on living shoreline, from living shorelines, from coastal restoration, other actions on living resources at Chesapeake Bay. And I'll show you a little bit of an example. That led to this paper we're working on the right, in which we propose a way to look at alternative restoration actions. Should you put marsh here or here? Should you reduce nutrient loading in the watershed in this location or that location? And you'll see that the same methods we're applying now in the Chesapeake Bay for the Bay Program restoration directly relate on a smaller scale, but to assessing different designs of a living shoreline. Should we put marsh here or should we put beaches? How wide should we make the marsh? So we're going to take these methods we're doing right now for the Chesapeake Bay program, and we'll applying them on a much smaller scale for living shoreline design. If you go straight down from there, that happens to be a best practices paper I wrote. There are quite a few of them. They overlap greatly, but we're working on other best practices, particularly for assessing habitat co-benefits at living shorelines. Now, if you go to the left, those are two other advisory groups I work with. One is the Columbia River, where we just wrote guidance on climate resilient restoration and mitigation strategies. This is for the Columbia River. And part of that was using habitat to both design the restoration in the Columbia River and to assess performance. The one in front is called ICES, which is the International Council for Exploration of the Sea. It's the European version of NOAA Fisheries. And I'm working with them. I'm a member of that working group. We're doing some papers on assessing habitat. Again, you'll see these threads are going to come together, we hope, in how they can be applied to living shorelines. And then finally, that paper I showed you earlier that had a lot of Horn Point people on it was funding that Ming Lee got from the National Science Foundation to summarize a lot of that information to make it accessible to practitioners. Part of the paper we're writing from the Chesapeake Bay shows that this concept of habitat suitability is being used in other large-scale restoration programs: Tampa Bay, Columbia River, Everglades, Puget Sound, coastal Louisiana. And so I'm going to dig deeper now into the habitat suitability ideas because we think they have a lot of promise for living shoreline assessment. So what is habitat suitability? Well, we'll go through this, but the best way to think of it is that top left. You have a section of the shoreline and the water, and each one's a cell, maybe 2 meters by 2 meters, 10 meters by 10 meters. And you're able to populate that with temperature, how much mud is there, which Cindy talked about, the vegetation along the shoreline, any number of these variables that people like Cindy measure. And by the way, her pictures of her in the field are a lot more interesting of my work day, which is mostly sitting in front of a computer. So you won't see any action photos of me, unfortunately. And what we do is we get that information. Now you can picture, let's say, temperature, substrate, and shoreline vegetation with a shoreline and without a shoreline. And what happens is the values of those variables in each of those cells changes because a marsh will have a very different substrate than an open water system, for example. And what we do is there's two ways to do it. They're both very analogous, but we are basically going to score each cell by combining how good the temperature is for a species, whether it likes that amount of mud or substrate, and does it like having marsh nearby or vegetation nearby. And we score those things, and that's that right-hand column, always 0 to 1, right? And then we combine those and get on the bottom left a overall map that says the way that system is looking now, and it could be with and without a living shoreline, for example, each cell is scored 0 to 1 due to some mathematics we do. And then we can add up the total area, but now it's weighted for how good it is for that species. each species would have a different set of relationships on the right-hand column, and you get a different habitat suitability map and a total area that's good depending on your species. So that's the concept we're working on. It's been used for over 50 years. It's been used in a lot of different places. It has a variety of names, but fundamentally, you score each important environmental variable and in each cell, and you combine them and score each cell and then add them up. This is not new, as I mentioned. There's a group at VIMS led by Mary Fabrizio who has done this for Chesapeake Bay, and I'm working with her right now to do it for Chesapeake Bay as part of that Caesar report that's been adopted by the Bay program. But now we're trying to do it to figure out where's a good place to restore certain habitats. Where would you get the most bang for the buck? And so Mary, addressing a different question, these are the kind of habitat maps, suitability maps you can generate. So each row is a species and each column is a season. And you can now look at these and decide where is a good place to work because we'll benefit the species we want to benefit, and it'll occur in what season. There are a lot of these versions, but none have been applied to prioritize where to do restoration from the Bay program's point of view, and that's what I'm working on. So far I haven't really talked about living shorelines. I'm about to though. So there are advantages to doing habitat suitability. One, really for Chesapeake Bay, the information is available pretty much already. That's the advantage of working in that system. We struggled much more when we did this in coastal Louisiana because we didn't have the extensive historical background data and the long-term many people studying the Bay. So that helps. I think everyone would say habitat is widely recognized as important. In fact, it's part of the legal proceedings in fisheries management. It's called essential fish habitat, and that gets special status. It's got pretty good confidence because it's saying we're going to score it 0 to 1, and it's quick. And hopefully you'll agree after I described it, it's not that complicated. It's pretty conceptually, it's like you're getting a report card for each cell and you're adding them up. Okay, what are the limitations? It sounds great. Well, one is that when we're building a living shoreline, for example, we're doing things on very fine scales in space, 1 meter, 2 meter decisions. And it's harder to really assess critters that move around like fish or crabs or birds. What does a snapshot in time look like, right? How relevant is that? Maybe they were just passing through, right? The other is that from a management point of view, we have to have the right ecology in there. So temperature is a good example. But we also have to have variables we can change in design. So for example, in a marsh, you might change stem density, but that means in your habitat model, there has to be a knob that you can turn on and off or change the amount of the stem density to see the effect. Otherwise, it won't have any effect. The other is that habitat is very static, we call it, and it doesn't like conditions that it hasn't seen before. So climate variation is one. Invasive species can really change how good what we thought was good habitat is for a species that has been disrupted by an invasive species. We don't eat habitat suitability, we eat biomass. So the relevance to us as stakeholders and also to managers, they really manage biomass and fisheries and stuff, is moderate, but the trade-off was the higher confidence in the calculations. So it's very good for certain questions, and we think living shorelines is one of them. Just remember when you say the habitat's good, it means that place, that cell, that volume can support a lot of organisms. It doesn't mean you'll really see it because other things can affect uh, the growth and survival and therefore the biomass you see. And so I put on the bottom there just some icons, and the middle one is, when you do this stuff, it sounds easy. 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish, just count them. It's not quite that easy, and habitat suitability may be a very good way to get 90% of the way there with more confidence. That's what we're going to try out. What makes this complicated is that many of our species they don't spend their whole life in the bay being exposed to either bay restoration actions or a living shoreline. This is 3 of 18 different strategies that were outlined in this paper called The Ways in Which Fish Use Estuaries. Some live in the estuary and go offshore to spawn. Some spawn, the bees, they spawn offshore and the youngsters come in to where the living shoreline would be, or to where Chesapeake Bay would be, the estuary. Some stay there their whole time. There's all these variations. And that kind of complicates the world for me, because what happens to them isn't only what happens in the living shoreline or in the bay, it's in conditions far away, off the shelf, off the coast. And so we have to try to untangle that. So it's complex life cycles. That was called connectivity from kind of big habitats, the ocean to the estuary to the river. We also have an issue of you can put all these habitats out there or restore them or design them. And on a much smaller scale, the critters still have to get to them. And that's the connectivity on this finer scale. And so you don't want to build it and have it so they can't really use it very well. So we think a lot about connectivity of the habitats within a living shoreline, within a region of the bay, depending on your scale. So this one's called Habitat Connectivity in Seascapes, like a landscape. So that's the connectivity issue. So, we can do the calculations for suitability, but then we have to layer on that connectivity, because it doesn't deal with the statisticals habitat suitability, and then resilience. And this is where Cindy's work, Laurie's work, other people at Horn Point are going to help the fisheries person. On the left was Holling's diagram in his 1973. And if you think about that, that's 50 years ago. And the idea of resilience is how far can you push that ball before it doesn't go back to where it started from. It goes over some threshold and goes to a new place. Just to show you how sometimes, for all my complicated diagrams, this is a simple diagram that was really changing, paradigm changing. For example, on the right is a recent review in physics about network resilience. And that diagram, while it's been expanded, should look familiar to the simpler one on the left. So we have a great concept. How we measure it to make sure there's enough resilience in these habitats, or the living shorelines, or the restored habitats in the bay. That's more of a challenge, is how we quantify that resilience. The good news is that Cindy and Laurie and others are working on that, I hope. So that's the second comp, right? So we have suitability, which is a static map of how good things are for different species. We have connectivity on a big scale, connectivity on a small scale, and then we have resilience. And those 3 you can take together, and we're moving forward now under funding from another group, and we're combining those 3 ideas into assessing and designing living shorelines. So here's some living shorelines and some critters that use it. Notice that each species uses typically more than one of these kind of habitats. So our job now with habitat suitability, connectivity, and resilience, particularly suitability, is to untangle this so that we could clearly see the trade-offs. If you put marsh here but beach here, which species habitats will go up by how much and which ones may go down by how much, and identify trade-offs as well. That's what we're trying to do. So what we're envisioning is the top is before, you remember the Backy design, so it's the before the living shorelines put in, and there's habitat there. It's not a desert out there now in many of these places. So we'll lose that, and then with the living shoreline, we'll gain. And you have a row for each species and life stage, and you can really start to decide, and stakeholders can be involved, and regulators and fisheries managers and everybody about how do you want to do these losses and gains, and then we can do different designs. And that's the bottom one, where you go, okay, we're going to go ahead with it, but where do we want to put these different, and what features do we want of these different habitats? And then we can compare design A, design B, design C, and it's not my role to pick the best one, but I think if you lay it out this way, the idea of this research is that it makes it much more transparent why you picked certain designs. And then all of them have to be looked at to make sure there's a connectivity and that they're resilient. So this is kind of the winding path, but we are headed in a direction of from a habitat as a co-benefit point of view, taking a lot of the stuff I've worked on and others at Horn Point, and taking them and adapting them and translating them for use with looking at living shorelines, gains and losses, and the performance of different designs. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Anna Johnson, who's with Bayland Consultants and Designers. And there's the title. She's a senior project engineer. And I'm going to summarize her qualifications very quickly. She has 15 years of experience in engineering analysis and design in a variety of places, including Chesapeake Bay. She has a master's degree from University of Technology in Delft. I didn't know that, in the Netherlands. And now we're moving a little bit outside the research arena. And how do we get this information to practitioners like Anna, who is on the ground designing specific projects of living shorelines, and try to make sure that it's informed by the best science? I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Kenny. So, everything that you've heard, prior to, what I'm going to talk about is all the information that feeds us as design engineers, and what are we actually looking at, and what are we doing with this information. So that's kind of, my presentation is going to mainly focus on the components of living shorelines that we've been implementing in Maryland. And then also just giving some examples of what you could see when you hear this term living shoreline. Well, what does that look like? So I'll show lots of photos, and then also talk a little bit about the engineering analysis that goes into how we decide what living shoreline is best for each individual property or group of properties, such as the Cambridge project. And then I'll finish off talking a little bit about what construction looks like as well. So when we talk about living shorelines, what I think we've heard about what that actually means. So as an engineer, we're looking at what are the pieces that we are looking at. And so almost every living shoreline is going to include some sort of enhancement of an existing shoreline with a substrate. And that substrate is typically sand. So sand is being placed along the shoreline, either as a beach nourishment or replenishment, or as a substrate for vegetation. So not most living shorelines are either going to take that as the base. The most basic of living shorelines is just adding sand and planting it. Um, Optional components are things like protection structures. So a lot of times if you have erosion, um, that is ongoing or more than just slight, you may want to put something that acts as your first line of defense, kind of breaks down the wave energy or slows down the flows that are causing that erosion. So, but once again, it's not a necessary component of a living shoreline. It's an optional component. And a lot of times the what you see, especially in Maryland, is you see a lot of stone in the form of a stone sill or a stone breakwater. There's also core logs, which actually disintegrate over time. So they're only there temporarily until the marsh vegetation has time to develop. And then that acts as the protection to slow the waves, because as waves go over marsh vegetation, it dissipates some of that erosive energy that was causing the erosion in the first place. Reefs are definitely becoming more and more popular now, recreating oyster reefs or any kind of reefs that provide some fisheries habitat, as some of the other speakers discussed. So that's also becoming, we're starting to see that as we talked about co-benefits of, if we can help protect the shoreline as well as provide this habitat, then it's a win-win. Other things such as just dead trees or fallen trees, repurposing them. I'm from Louisiana, and one of the most popular programs was the Christmas tree pickup, where they would put the Christmas trees out and let those serve as shoreline protection for the year. So also something that happens. Oyster bags, which just contain oyster shells in them, and then also there's what I'm going to refer to as manufactured modules, where there's definitely a new trend of coming up with different configurations usually out of concrete or some other kind of substrate that kind of helps dissipate wave energy and provide other benefits, depending on on how it's configured. And then also the vegetation. Vegetation is kind of a biggie with living shorelines. Usually it's going to be some sort of marsh grasses or beach grasses is what you're typically going to see most in Maryland. So the next slide, so I'll kind of walk through some of these components. The protection structures, as I mentioned, stone sills and breakwaters. The picture at the top left is an example of what you would see. That's there now. That particular example has structures that are perpendicular to the shoreline as well as parallel. And so they act to break down some of the wave energy that's causing the erosion, as well as help contain that sand there. The picture in the middle top is what I talked about, the woody debris, the dead trees, just using materials that are on site. Erosion has caused maybe some trees to fall. So instead of a big, expensive project, why don't we reuse those trees, secure them in place, and then they can provide some of that wave dissipation to help protect it. The oyster bags, this is actually a picture off of NOAA's website. It's in North Carolina. I am not personally familiar with a project in Maryland where they use these kind of oyster bags, but I know that they've done it in Florida and North Carolina, where you're looking at lower flows like back creeks and that type of thing, where you can this is a very effective and cheap and easily implementable method to protect your shoreline, because it can literally be deployed by hand. So you don't need heavy equipment or contractor's licenses or anything like that. So that's nice. The picture at the bottom right is what's called a vegetated headland. So it's a structure that actually incorporates grasses and vegetation in the actual structure to help break down that wave energy. So that's an example of doing something that provides the habitat as well as the protection to the marsh. In the middle is like those concrete modules that I was discussing. They take many different shapes and sizes. This is also a picture that's not from Maryland. I don't believe it's from Maryland. I'm not 100% certain where it's from, honestly, but it's a good example of these pre-manufactured modules that can get they can also get spatted with oyster shell to kind of oh, oh, okay. Just to kind of, help, speed up the natural germination of oysters on the structures. And then finally, the last picture is the core log. Like I said, that will, after a year or two, that will disintegrate. And then usually we put some toe protection right there with some smaller rock that's usually submerged to kind of help that oops. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I muted myself, but I didn't. So the next slide. So now we talk about the actual shoreline part of the living shoreline. So for the top left is just a picture of a dense marsh vegetation. That's kind of your most popular, which you see in living shorelines around here. But sandy beaches for recreational purposes, those are also, and they also have habitat value. They, the birds and terrapins and different other creatures use this substrate. So that's also a living shoreline, kind of can be the main part of the living shoreline. Cobble beaches and with pebbles, and that adds a little bit more sturdiness to the actual living shoreline, so that maybe you don't need a protection structure. So that's also something that we've seen. That particular picture is Havre de Grace. And then the bottom right or the bottom left picture is just another picture of that cobble beach, but with the marsh vegetation. So then we take that, we mix sand into it, we can plant it, and it has that sturdiness, but also supports that vegetation as well. And then you have mixed habitats. So this was a living shoreline that after a year or two, it kind of did its own thing. We had a little bit of sandy area, and then we had some vegetation growing in areas that were calmer, but it was allowed to, become what it wanted to become. Next slide. Okay, and then so you have your protection structure, which is out in the seaward most portion. Then you have your substrate, your marsh terrace or your beach. That's the middle part. And then we like to implement what's called transitional areas. So this is just somewhere for the marsh to walk back as sea levels rise, as well as an area that takes you from tidal waters all the way up to the upland areas where we have development and people live and things like that. So vegetated forest back shores, that's always nice when you have that vegetation that goes all the way back into the uplands. Coastal dunes, also pretty popular, just vegetated sand pockets at higher elevations. What we've also been doing a lot is we have these tall, steep banks. A lot of areas in Maryland have these tall, steep banks. So we actually grade those banks back to make them a softer slope and then plant them to make that transition area. Or like the bottom picture is, we leave it alone. And it's a tall bank that's directly behind the living shoreline. And what happens there is that erosion actually continues until the bank reaches its own stability. And it's also a very natural approach. Eventually that bank will, the toe of it may erode a little bit, and then it'll kind of collapse on itself, but then it becomes stable. It's not moving after that. So that's also a big component of what we see. The next slide, we'll talk a little bit about just what kind of alignments, continuous sills along the shoreline. This was very popular, I want to say about 10 years ago. We don't do this as much anymore, but it's just putting a low crested rock sill all along the bottom of a marsh. What we do more is what's on the top right is the segmented sills that kind of follow the shoreline. We want the segments in there so the critters can actually get up and use the marsh, have a way in. It's better flushing as well when you have these gaps in it. But then this one actually kind of follows the shoreline, so it has kind of a natural look to it. The bottom left is straight segmented sill, so that's when we're restoring to a previous shoreline, and so it's a straight. The structure itself is straight, and you have these bay areas that are created because the calmest area is directly behind the structure. The gaps is the most active area, so these natural bays create in this area. or we place the structure offshore and we let this creates more shallow water habitat. So this is another big co-benefit for fisheries and other creatures that want to use, that really live in that calm pocket, those calm pockets of tidal waters. Goes into, as engineers, you know, we look at, when we're designing living shorelines, we're looking at three things basically: waves, what's the wave action? We look at wind is what causes these waves, so we look at the wind speeds that are impacting it, and then what we call fetch, which is the for longest distance that a wave can travel unobstructed. So if the wind is blowing over the bay, in this particular in the top right picture, you know, we're looking at that 17 miles to the northeast, because that's the largest wave can be generated from that direction if the wind's blowing from there. We also look at storm water levels, storm surges in particular. We want to design our living shorelines to last 25 years, to survive the 25-year storm. So we look at, okay, what are historic water levels? What have they been? What are projected water levels? That's where sea level rise comes in. Currently, we're looking at 2050 sea level rise is our goal to for our living shorelines, because that matches that 25 years out. So we want to design for our living shoreline to still be functioning in 25 years, which puts us at 2050. And then my next slide, just some more engineering analysis. There's all these different equations that we can use to determine how big the gaps should be, how long the structures, how far the structures should be. And then how the shoreline is going to respond to that. All right, my next, and then I think my final slide, it just touches on the construction. So when we go to construct these living shorelines, what is the actual method of construction? So typically, contractors can either access by land or water. If it's too shallow, they usually have to come in by land. If it's very forested or very densely populated, then we usually prefer them to come in by water. So the picture shows construction. Usually the structures, the stone is constructed from the water because it's out in the water, and then it's backfilled with the sand and planted. So some of the equipment you see: excavators, bulldozers, tugboats, supply barges, deck barges. So this is heavy construction. And then, so these are just some photos. That's the top right is stone being delivered to a site on one of these big, large barges that has to, you know, anchor offshore because it's drafts too much. Or it can be hauled in, like the middle left picture. You can haul it in and drop it. Sand can be brought in the exact same way, either hauled in and placed, or brought in by barge. And then typically the cost to construct a living shoreline, what we're seeing now is kind of simpler living shorelines with a protection structure, marsh and vegetation, is usually about $500 a linear foot. And then, but once you get to bigger, more complex designs, you know, some of them have reached up to, you know, $1,200 a linear foot. But that's just kind of a range of what we're seeing that these cost. So none of these are ever really cheap endeavors. So, and I believe that was my last slide. So I get to do the honors of passing it back to Jenny to manage the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Anna. So we've been watching the chat. I haven't really seen anything in there, but you certainly can do so and use the chat, or and you can see how to use that chat on your screen there on the right-hand side. Make sure if you are putting something into the chat when you write your message that you push that little arrow. It will send the message in, or just simply mute yourself and ask the question. And if we have a bunch of questions, we'll ask you to raise your hand. So along that bottom toolbar, you'll see the little hand, and then we'll call on folks. But at this point, let's just go ahead, and if someone wants to unmute themselves and ask any of our panelists a question, we'd love to hear your questions. So,
Hello.
Oh, go ahead.
Where do you raise your hand? I don't. Oh, there. I see that. So
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't do that. Okay, my question was, in the Cambridge project, So you were talking about a waiver. There are certain areas where you could have it might be determined that you can have a bulkhead or some other structure. In the Cambridge project, I'm not sure where something like that would be suggested, because I know that I've looked at some of the grants that are offered to municipalities, and it says that no projects with structures like bulkheads and stuff would be considered uh, eligible for grants. So I'm just wondering where um, a waiver would be, and the structures would be used, and if in the Cambridge project, could the people that are living on by the water, would they be able to say, I would like to submit a waiver?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Allison. This is Sam Ecker with DNR. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So that determination is made by Maryland Department of the Environment. So that's MDE. And you can certainly submit a request to have your shoreline or any portion of shoreline assessed for a waiver. You mentioned funding also. Typically funding, at least the funding that I'm familiar with, for living shoreline and habitat restoration projects would not go towards a strictly structural approach. Something that would be granted as part of a waiver would not also get funding from a lot of these funding sources where the goal is habitat creation. Where you might see waivers being administered or approved, typically, like Laura said in her presentation, there will be a number of factors that would need to be checked off. So that could be high wave energy, deep water. We'd be happy to send you more information on that if you're interested. And but that's why you typically see them in marinas and areas like that where it's not feasible to do a living shoreline, because you won't have the same result. Does that answer your question? And anyone else?
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we do have a question that was in the chat. I don't know if our speakers can see this one. It's from Catherine, and she's asking about a property, a waterfront property and stabilization, what's on the map and the blue line. Can you see that, speakers? So I don't know who wants to field. She has a 4-part. She did a great job with asking her questions.
I can speak to some of them if you're talking about your specific property. And in the question about how far out into the water can the living shoreline go, that is dependent on a couple things. If the closer it is to shore, kind of the faster the permitting goes. But it usually the 1972 line, like where your shoreline was in 1972, is a good marker that we like to use. So we like to put marsh vegetation back, or if you have a beach. It doesn't sound like you do. You can't build a beach if you didn't have a beach. But we usually put that back to where 1972 was, and that's usually what the regulatory folks like. So depending on where that was, that's how far out you can go. Who can I work with to design a living shoreline? Is there a charge for design work? Yes, typically there is a fee of usually around 10%, 8 to 10% of what the construction cost is. Typically what you can expect design to cost as well. DNR gives out grants for design as well as for construction. So definitely you can coordinate with them. There's a lot of different grant agencies out there Chesapeake Bay Trust also gives out grants as well. So there's different options for you there. How much does it cost to construct a living shoreline for such a small property? I would say yes, that 500 to 1,200 would still apply. A lot of times, there's still a lot of components that still go into it, even if you have a small property. But there could be some cost savings depending on what you want to do. Can I have a small dock if I put in a living shoreline? Absolutely. Riparian access rights are protected, and you are allowed to access your waterfront and have a dock. We usually just integrate it into the living shoreline, whether it's a pier or a dock or something else. So that's and then finally, where are they looking to put a living shoreline in the Cambridge area? So there is an ongoing flood protection effort that is looking to put a flood barrier as an embankment that is fronted with a living shoreline. It's going to stretch from approximately Cambridge Creek. No, I shouldn't say that. I should say the marina property, north of the marina property, all the way to the other side of Jerry Boyle Park. So that's the plan there. If anyone wants to add to any of those responses.
I see that Sam did include some information for Catherine in the chat. Thank you, Sam. Allison has another question in the chat. When deciding what seagrasses and other vegetation to be used, do you have to only put in plants that are in the vicinity? Do you have to be careful about introducing something that might be invasive? So I'm not sure who wants to handle that question.
I mean, I can say from a design standpoint, you don't want to put invasives in. I don't think that would be really kind of supported by anybody. The permitting agencies in particular, they don't do well. They don't provide habitat for the creatures in the area. So yes, putting plants that are already existing in the vicinity is always a good idea because they have the best chance of survival. But as long as what you put in is a native and appropriate for that location, then there shouldn't be any issues.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yes, I certainly see the living shoreline as being something that we should have all along the west end. But my concern is how we put this berm in of 5-6 feet. It seems to me it blocks the water view from the street and from along Hembrooks Boulevard, all these areas. You can't really see the water anymore. How does the living shoreline tie into this berm?
So for the Cambridge project specifically, the living shoreline will tie directly into the berm. The berm is there as that main flood protection barrier. That's what's going to stop the waters of the chop tank from flooding into the city. So, and the living shoreline ties into it and provides kind of the first line of defense. Helps protect that berm too, because if that berm fails, then you have New Orleans Hurricane Katrina type situation. So that living shoreline helps protect it, as well as providing all the co-benefits of the habitat that were mentioned before.
I mean, I see the benefits of the habitat, and it like a dike almost. If you're talking about New Orleans, that's what it was. So is it 5 feet high off the water from where water is now? Is that the mean water line? How high is this? I saw the example on, on Water Street. How high is that? I mean, I can't see the water anymore over that berm. Like when I moved here 15 years ago, I came here because of the water. I could see it. If that berm goes up, my view's going to end up being a mountain. I can see the shoreline on the other side, but not the 2 miles of water between our shoreline and Talbot County. So I'm not sure how this. I understand what you're doing with this dike structure, but then you're going to have a slope that goes down with the living shoreline from that height, when you drop the 5 feet, that feathers out into the water, what, 100 feet or 200 feet?
So I mean, I guess we can answer questions about the embankment and the specific Cambridge project. So that the embankment is proposed at a +7, which is
7 feet, okay.
yes, but that's above the mean sea level. The existing ground elevation is already about a 3 or 4 feet, and so this adds like 3 or 4 feet above the ground elevation.
Mhm.
And yeah, so we've put out the model berm, and we're currently collecting comments on that. So I think maybe that would be you know, submitting your comment or your thoughts and feelings on that to you can submit it to the team, but that's that's what the model berm is out there for, is to solicit public comment.
So we submit them to this team. I would email one of you.
Yes, you can do that. You can submit on the website, and then we'll be coming out again in January, February timeframe to do.
You mean out physically to Cambridge? You mean on another Zoom meeting?
I'm sorry. So we'll be coming out physically to do with 60% design to present that. And the purpose of the berm was to make sure that everyone in the Cambridge area had an opportunity to see what that would actually look like, and not just conceptually from the drawings. And so when we come out, we'll be definitely getting your additional input from area residents and talking about the project and the benefits and the cost of the project and the trade-offs. So that will definitely be one of our next steps. One of the things we wanted to do leading up to that was to provide some information about components and parts of the project, to provide some context and additional information for folks so they could really have an informed idea about what's happening, and make those thoughts themselves. And so we'll be interested in hearing that coming up at that session and at future sessions, but as well as through our What Project website, and then the contact information that you have.
Okay, I mean, so Anna, I think it's more your area. If this berm is 7 foot high, then with what slope would you go out into the water? Is like a 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1?
So the berm itself is built at like a 2-to-1, but it ties into the living shoreline, which that living shoreline has a very gentle slope of 10-to-1. And
10 to
that's that,
1.
and that has a marsh platform there. So it's
So that
10
would
to
go
1
out
in
into,
bush.
so that would go from the top of the berm out into the river 70 feet.
Yes, in certain areas. So if you're talking about Long Wharf Park or Duck Walk Park, that along Water Street where the model berm is, there won't be a living shoreline there because obviously it's the marina. So
Sure. But
so
I mean,
there,
Great Marsh,
but in
I mean, yeah, Great Marsh, I mean,
yeah.
you're going to have this big berm and it's going to go out into the chop tank. Then behind it, it's going to trap. How will water get from on the other side of the berm?
So that's that actually leads into Mr. Wheeler's question that was posted about part of the Cambridge initiative is not only preventing coastal flooding, but preventing stormwater flooding as well, and collecting stormwater and more efficiently getting stormwater out of the city faster. And so that is a huge component of the project, in addition to this berm and living shoreline that we're doing. And in answer to Mr. Wheeler's question about the stormwater system installation prior to and concurrent with the embankment, it will be done. The plan is that it will be done prior to, because it needs to be up and running for when the embankment comes in, to ensure that we're not impounding water once the embankment is in.
Yeah, I mean, I live at number 6 Oakley, and the new seawall, water's not coming over it, but it doesn't pass. It doesn't stop the water from coming up through it. And then when stormwater comes down, I mean, there's no one-way valve there that should be operating. I mean, when it was installed, we were led to believe it was going to work that way. I personally, was looking more of for a living shoreline when they did that in more of an H design, but they chose to do it the way they did it. But it traps the water, and I'm fearful that Great Marsh is going to turn it back into a marsh again. I mean, Great Marsh was a marsh in the 60s, right?
So there, like, I definitely encourage you to look at the Make Cambridge Resilient website, because that will present a lot of the details that are proposed, especially, great Jerry Boyle Park. There's a large plan there for actually storage of stormwater in one part of the park to keep the other part of the park dry. So and then the almost all the piping system in that area is going to be replaced, and there's going to be pump stations added and all that to address
Yeah,
getting
well,
water.
I don't know if there's any pipes up there, but it just, it seems like we're going to be trapping the water. But I guess if we're going to add pipes under this dike, then that would let it back out. Then, like at the boat ramp, is it going to be like a big ramp up over top of it to bring it back into the ramp?
So
Or are they going to get rid of the boat ramp?
No, the embankment is a good bit landward of the boat ramp. The boat ramp will stay in its current location. The parking stays in its current location, and the embankment is actually landward of it at that area.
So probably not even in the same parking lot that's there now, because that's maybe 150 feet wide. You're saying
Right.
we push back farther.
The embankment's further back, so that parking lot will continue to flood as it does today.
Yeah, I just, to me, this whole thing of blocking the water view for the town is just very upsetting to myself and a lot of others. I mean, we didn't move here to look at a berm. I've been here 15 years, and I am curious about all the data, because obviously I don't want to do anything that's wrong, but at the same time, it's wrong when I lose my water view. If I lived in a house on the water and had a second story, I wouldn't be losing my view, but I don't. And most of the people in town don't live on the water with a 2-story house.
So one question kind of to speak to this a little bit is from Tom, and Tom put in that will you have an opportunity to hear about how these concepts, some of the concepts that were talked about tonight, are being applied in the Cambridge project at the future session? And the answer is yes. And so some of the information that was presented tonight and its applicability to the Cambridge project, that will be part of the future sessions plan for outreach. And I know we're going to hear comments about this project, and there's never a large project where we're not hearing comments, pros, cons, and things like that, and that is part of this process. So we're collecting that information. Remember that the information we collected prior to even engaging and starting a grant for this project was that the concern about flooding. So first and foremost, keep in mind, while we do have co-benefits, this was and always has been a flood protection project.
Well, I mean, tonight's presentation was all about living shorelines, not about building.
Because that is one
so
of the
I guess I'm confused.
Sir. You're correct. You're absolutely
the whole hour and a half was about living shorelines. We're really building a dike.
So let's talk about that just a minute, why that would be. So at the last, at some of our previous outreach meetings, we were specifically requested to talk about living shorelines because it is one of the project components, and to provide information as to how they function, what are the benefits, what are the trade-offs, if any, and why this was included as a project component. So tonight and the recording is an opportunity for folks to learn more about that component of the project. And instead of just learning from the design team, we ask that other speakers come in and talk about why and the living shorelines are applied and applicable in Maryland, how they function, what's the research. And so that's what the point of tonight's education session was about. And so
they were great.
We're going to give a lot of different opportunities for outreach and just ways to learn about the project. So this is just one of those.
So how much sea level rise have we had since like 1990? the last 35 years.
Actually, I think if you can go back to maybe like 3 slides up, if I'm not mistaken, the Cambridge.
Yeah, I can't really see. It's too small on my screen, but
Well,
I'm
but
interested.
yeah,
1990, since 1990, how much have we had?
so you can, it's pretty small, but if this presentation becomes available, you could kind of look at, you know, the trend, and you can actually see if you look at the very wiggly blue line,
Right.
the black and the red lines show the average trends, and you can see how you've, since 2000, I would say 5 in particular, you're seeing a lot more of the blue is higher than the trend, and especially in the last, you know, if you look at like 2015 up, then the blue, the average is almost completely above what the trend has been. And
So how
I
many
think
inches is it? That's my question.
so on average, well, just the numbers that we throw out is, you know, it's been about a foot in the last 100 years.
Okay. So it's
It's
going to take
been,
700 years for this wall to be in effect?
well, no, because that's average sea level, but it takes, you know, when you get a storm like Isabel, you know,
Right.
what our analysis show is that an Isabel storm, which was considered kind of like 100-year storm in the past, is actually in 2050 is anticipated to be a 20-year storm. So, you know, I don't want to say it'll be once every 20 years, but statistically speaking, you get, you know, um, a,
I mean, I
a
understand
5%
FEMA.
chance of
Yeah, I
that
understand
happening.
the FEMA map of 100-year floods and 500-year floods. I'm
Right.
familiar with that. And my house is on, I'm out of the flood zone. You know, I'm out of the 100-year zone, whatever it is. But that's what I'm trying to understand, how much we're doing here to take the view of the river away from everyone for something that's not going to happen for 300-400 years.
No, that's what Isabel
I'd
was a.
like to see the data, I guess. Who can I email about that? Email you, Anna?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well,
Okay.
to the specific data I think that you're looking for would probably be the assessment that was done prior to the start of design, right, Jenny? You think that would be the best, that shows the flood maps created?
Also, if you Google presidential or disaster declarations, you can see the disaster declarations for Maryland. So consider our funding source, our major funding source for this project is for disasters. So we're not even talking about nuisance flooding or roadwide flooding. We are talking about flooding that would come into those properties along your shoreline and basically really cause damage to those structures. And so the idea of these programs is that you would minimize the risk of flooding, and then to the rest of the taxpayers, we would minimize this constant cycle of paying out insurance claims and rebuilding. And so also not to mention the health concerns from black mold and then our responders in these areas. They say that the National Building of Sciences, there's lots of data out there that says one of the best investments we make it for our government taxpayer dollars are in mitigation. In fact, across the board, it's about a 7-to-1 ratio, a return for our investment. And so when this project started, it was about first and foremost, and continues to be, about protecting the city of Cambridge from this devastating type event. I know that I did damage assessment for the state back in Isabel. And so it's one of those things that, you know, we talk about these other project components, which are wonderful, but we need to keep in mind that this is a flood mitigation project. And so we'll be showing all the components of the project, and we'll continue to do outreach on this. And it's something that the community, we just have to keep working through the process and see where we land. But the city was awarded funding to go forward with a design to mitigate it against disasters. And so disasters would be those type of storms. And so it's about your, you know, I always say it's, you know, might not have happened, but if the average mortgage, you have a 26% chance of being flooded in 30 years. It's higher than any type of fire a property could withstand. So can you imagine if you're along the shoreline? So those are the things that, you know, we're working through, but it's definitely has trade-offs. It really does. And so want to keep working through the process and see what the community has to say about it and the property owners that would be most affected to a flood from the flood waters.
Yeah, I guess, I'll leave you alone. Obviously, you're tired of me, I'm sure. But I mean, for me, taking my water view away,
It's a,
probably takes part of my property value away. I mean, these
I
are
hear you,
certainties to
sir.
me. They're not guesstimates or think it might happen this or that way. These are things that are going to happen. And once we lose our water view, it takes value away from our properties.
So, and that's a valid point. And so we also look after disasters that you can say consider what a property values are after a disaster in that area as well. So there's lots of ways to looking at any one thing. But this is part of the process and what we want to hear from the community. I know that Catherine did say, is the model berm up yet? And is it to scale? And the
Well,
answer,
that's what got my attention. I couldn't
I
believe I
know,
couldn't see
well, that's
couldn't
why
see
we
the
put it
water
out there.
anymore.
We wanted to make sure that everyone was able to see what we're really talking about. So there's no surprise, so people could walk up to it. I know I have some pictures on the website. So if you're up against it, it kind of shows where one of our designers, Megan, is in the pictures, and it shows where she's at standing. Michelle and I actually were out there putting up the sign, and so we've been looking at it too. So it was an opportunity. It was something that the community asked for. They said, hey, you know, you're coming out with these drawings, we're talking about these things, but we want to see what this looks like. So we, you know, that was the next step. And then they also asked for more information on these living shorelines and to really hear about some other project components. So December, this month, this is what this has been about, is really showing the community what the model berm would look like in this to scale. It is to scale. And then really getting the experts in to talk about some of the components of this project and why they have been included in the project.
All right, sorry to take up so much of your time.
We appreciate the comments, sir, and thank you so much for participating, and please continue to do so. You're not the only one, and we know that, and so we definitely want to keep engaging along this process. Cindy, also, if you're looking at the chat at all, Cindy, earlier speaker did put in some information about our projections. The University of Maryland every 5 years puts out these projections in a report. The 2023 report is out, and you can definitely look at that. I also would encourage you to look at the tide gauge there and the tide gauge data at Cambridge. It is very telling. And so that tide gauge, Cindy has put that in the chat as well. I do have that on the website. I might put that more front and center for folks. It gives a lot of information that I think is eye-opening, and it also is information directly from the gauge itself and not us saying what that information is. There is also Catherine, Water Street. Yes, Catherine just gave additional information that this berm is there in the Long Wharf Park area, what the community calls the duck walk area. And it should be up for another week or so. We wanted to make sure it was up long enough for folks really to get a chance to see that. So encourage your neighbors. If someone hasn't in the community been able to see that yet, we strongly encourage folks to see that and really be able to come out to our next meetings and other public outreach events that we have. and be able to have an informed and to say, yes, we know what that looks like now. And then, oh, Cindy also indicated, I don't know if you guys are looking at the chat, that the report includes estimates for storm surge. So it's really the combination of all these things. So we most definitely encourage folks to look up this information for themselves and really see things, and so that we're not just telling you these things, you're seeing it for yourself, and there's opportunities for you to get that information. Are there other questions that you might have that we can, while we have our speakers, it's kind of getting on to 8 o'clock, so I don't want to keep them too long, but is there any other questions for our speakers that we had tonight?
I just had sorry to interrupt you. I just had a comment to make. There was a handout that was given in September about other projects that are going on around the Chesapeake Bay. And I did look at them, and it just seems to me that they are all very similar to what is being proposed for Cambridge. And, it's just, it kind of made me feel very confident that what is being told to us is state of the art, the way to go, and the preferred way to go. And so I would just encourage anybody who wanted more information to look at some of those sites, because they're informative and they have pictures.
Thank you. And we will, I know that is on the website, but we'll continue to bring that and push that information out. That was another thing that the community asked for. They said, hey, where can we go see these things for ourselves? Because we're talking about the design, but we want to see what this looks like. And so that handout Allison's talking about is available, and it has links to the information, but also we were trying to find things that were in driving distance that weren't too far that folks could go out and see. So yes, we'll be continuing to push that handout, because that did give folks a chance to look, and it was in direct answer to what people at other sessions asked and requested. All right. Thank you so much for participating tonight. And we're, like I said, we'll be posting this, and we also, during the public outreach sections, we're tracking comments and looking to see what other information that the community members want about aspects of this project, and ways we can provide that information to you along this process. And so we just had our 30% in the fall, so we'll have 60% design here in late January, February, and we'll just keep working through the process and providing as much information and in the most transparent way that we're able to do so to the community.